Hi everyone, this is Andrew Primer, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 137 of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this is the third week of October 2024. In today's podcast, we're not going to talk about the recent updates at the front lines, but we're going to talk about the invitation that Ukraine is waiting to join NATO, which will be a strong signal to Russia. And this might be the only solution to end this bloody war. And we're also going to talk about how important to continue helping Ukraine because despite the financing, despite the military aid, which is definitely insufficient, Ukraine is still losing settlements every week. So Kiev sees the invitation to NATO as a strong signal to Russia. It might be the only solution to end the bloody war. Both the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, and the former commander in chief of Ukraine Armed Forces, Valery Zaluzhny, talk about the Euro Atlantic integration of Ukraine as the main tool that can lead to end the Russian Ukrainian war. No specifics are heard in response, except that NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte emphasized the inevitability of Ukraine's accession to NATO, although he didn't name any specific terms of such joining. So let's talk about how realistic can Ukraine join NATO. First of all, this decision to invite Ukraine into NATO must be made by the Euro-Atlantic Council. That is, to make this decision, a meeting at the highest level is not even necessary. A meeting of the ambassadors of the alliance member countries is definitely sufficient. It is at the meeting that the criteria to be taken into account for Ukraine's entry into the North Atlantic Alliance should be defined. If you remember, when Finland and Sweden, NATO privileged partners, were recently accepted, it was established that their partnership with the alliance had already led to the fact that they were no different in terms of standards from other NATO members, and therefore, this distance from the invitation and the decision on membership actually did not exist. With regards to Ukraine, other mechanisms may be applied, but it also depends on when exactly Ukraine will be invited to NATO. Maybe by the time the country will already meet the standards of the alliance, or maybe it will be necessary to do some homework for Ukraine, which will require quite a few years. When Ukraine is recognized as meeting all standards, the NATO summit must decide on its acceptance. Of course, there will be no problems with this. After all, if the invitation to membership is approved by the votes of all members of NATO, of Euro-Atlantic Council, it will mean that a corresponding decision must also be made at the NATO summit. Of course, if the leadership in one or more NATO members countries doesn't change during the time between the invitation and submit, the new government will not support the position of its predecessors. However, let's hope that we will deal with the consensus of all NATO countries and the national consensus in each of them. And now the NATO summit solemnly adopts the relevant decision. Does this mean that Ukraine has already become a full member of the alliance and the famous fifth article applies to it? No, unfortunately, it doesn't. The flag of Ukraine near the headquarters of NATO will be raised only after all parliaments of NATO member countries ratify the relevant protocol. How long it will take, no one can actually say. If some leaders have the desire not to deny the consensus within NATO, but also not to neglect their own relations with Moscow, they can go down the path of delaying this decision. Yes, and even without Moscow, one can imagine attempts at such inhibition, say, if some concessions are needed from Washington and there is an understanding that the US is interested in the Euro Atlantic integration of Ukraine. The president of Turkey followed exactly this path during the admission of Finland and Sweden to NATO. Erdogan's last condition for Sweden's entry was supply of F-16 fighter jets to his country. What was the Sweden's attitude to this? Nothing. Just Erdogan wanted to get these planes. And now the Turkish president emphasizes that Ukraine's membership in NATO is not an issue that needs to be resolved in a hurry. I will also remind you about the obvious opposition to the accession of Ukraine by the Prime Minister of Hungary and Slovakia, Viktor Orban and Robert Fico. Are any intermediate security guarantees possible between the decision on invitation and the decision on membership and the final ratification of this decision by the parliaments of the NATO countries? Theoretically, after being invited to NATO, individual NATO countries, we understand that we are talking primarily about the US and Britain as nuclear powers, can provide their own guarantees, but the content of these guarantees is important. If you remember, Ukraine has signed Budapest Memorandum back in the day, about 20 years ago, and this memorandum, with all the guarantees that was actually provided by Britain and the United States, they didn't help Ukraine and didn't protect Ukraine from invasion of Russian Federation. That's why, again, the substance of these guarantees is really important. So during the accession of Sweden and Finland, such guarantees were in the form of strong political support from the NATO countries, in depth military exercises, and the expansion of the presence of the North Atlantic Alliance in the Baltic Sea. In addition, it was planned to strengthen cooperation in the field of intelligence in countering various threats, including in cyberspace. As we can see, there is nothing similar to the fifth article, and this is despite the fact that Sweden and Finland were not at war with anyone at the time of joining the alliance. There are no guarantees in these guarantees. They by and large, do not differ much from those agreements that Ukraine is already signing with some NATO member states. But even the existence of such guarantees was denied. And it must be understood that decision on any guarantees before joining NATO is a matter of goodwill for Washington and London. By and large, similar security guarantees could have had could be without the admission process. But the main thing to understand is when Article 5 comes into effect. That is when Ukraine gets the right to turn to its partners for military support in the event of attack on itself. This right is granted only after the integration process ends, only after all parliament ratify the protocol on Ukraine's acceptance. That is why President Zelensky victory plan is about an invitation to NATO. If we were talking about acceptance, this chronologically should not be the first but the last point of the plan. In Kiev, the invitation to NATO is seen as a strong signal to Russia that Ukraine will be in NATO and the Allies will not refuse to accept it. There is apparent political logic in this, but in recent years, dictator Vladimir Putin has been paying attention not to the signals but only to actions. So the West cannot afford to get tired from the war. Why? Partners should actually increase the military and financial aid to Ukraine as soon as possible because Ukraine is losing settlements on a weekly basis during several reasons: lack of weapons, lack of people, and lack of financing. Ukraine is not going to give up even if US aid is it gets cut next year. Europe clearly understand that and they know what's going on. However, Ukraine remains vulnerable in the sense that the war could be frozen due to the lack of resources and weakening global interest. This will give Putin's system time to adapt, So when he comes back for another round, what's wrong with his war machine will be partially fixed. If the world should have learned any lesson from the example of the COVID pandemic, it is how dangerous it is to allow the virus to mutate and expand. And that is what imperialism likely is, a plug that drives its masters insane until they destroy themselves. Putin's empire is not the only one, but it's clearly the most in terms of its current influence. The Russians cannot develop a decentralized paradigm of conducting operations using small units and becoming masters of the war in the network era. Putin's system is too inflexible for that. What the Russians may be able to do in the future is to saturate a target area with so much remotely delivered firepower that it becomes indefensible. The result will be a desert, but it will still be a conquest. If the Russians can find a way to sustain large scale, all out attacks for weeks and months at a time, the growing shortage of Soviet equipment won't matter as much. The recent incident in which the Russians shut down their own rare experimental stealth drone over Ukraine territory, some 20 kilometers behind the front line, shows that the Russians are already planning what they will do when the moment comes when they cannot use manned aircraft near Ukraine. Gliding bombs, unfortunately, are much more powerful than missiles and shells. Although the Ukrainian brigades skillfully apply territorial defense tactics, there are often no positions left that could be recaptured in a counterattack. Under these conditions, in most cases, it is irresponsible to ask Ukrainian troops to hold such fortress as Vuglidar. The same problem with the Ukrainian efforts elsewhere. Ukraine is still in a position where the best strategic choice is to trade land for the time on most fronts. But it is partners finally commit. But if the partners finally commit to fully supporting a proper counteroffensive effort, then by the next spring, Moscow's president desired to lose 10,000 more soldiers every month than it can train will drive the Russian army into yet another personal crisis. There is already a shortage of equipment, and the situation will not improve in the near future. And in the middle of 2025 will be a turning point in the supply of artillery and tanks. If we assume that Ukraine will finally receive the full support from its partners, which it has always deserved, then it will be possible to put Moscow in such an awkward position that Putin will not be able to recover. When the entire country mobilizes its economic potential and uses its surplus to support military operations, hidden costs begin to rise. A crisis is inevitable, and postponing it only exacerbates its consequences. Ukraine will be able to take advantage of this now that it has proven that Putin's red lines are illusory, provided adequate support. The main goal of Ukraine in this war, in addition to survival, is to save the lives of as many people as possible. Perhaps this is the only country in recent history that has deliberately decided to exclude young Ukrainians from participating in the conflict and instead send citizens of the older generation to the front. Given the fact that the drones are increasingly good at striking air bases and Ukraine is developing its own ballistic and cruise missiles, the best target for NATO weapons are likely to be ammunition and fuel depots, headquarters, and railway bridges far behind the front lines. In the crudest sense, there is a utility efficiency ratio applied to combat power, which determines its real effect. And the more you hit the most important nodes of the supply chain, the lower this ratio becomes. This effect is hard to see at first, but it begins to show as exposure accumulates. As soon as Ukraine will be able to reliably repulse the attacks of plane and bombs and intercept the logistics of the invaders at the strategic level, more sophisticated ground based air defense equipment and interceptor drones will be able to blind the enemy in certain areas of the front. This will make it possible to create impulses of action when Ukrainian troops will again be able to use the mass and speed to surpass the enemy in field conditions. An important component of this work is more modern armored vehicles, and all of them must have standard means of protection against drones, reactive armor blocks, a net that covers the gaps in which the drone will try to hit, in means of electronic countermeasures. Nothing can change the fact that the Ukrainian forces also need more tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and armored personnel carriers. NATO will have to take a risk and reduce active stockpiles, hoping to obtain alternative supplies from Middle East, for example. The Middle East countries which have been buying the weapons for decades. For that matter, Iran will not attack the Emirates or Saudi Arabia as long as it's occupied by Israel. Despite the fact that the Czech program for the purchase of 155 mm shells abroad discuss funding problems, in general, Ukraine now reports firing one shell for every three Russian ones. Can you imagine this huge disadvantage? Which, taking actually into account accuracy, means approximately parity. European production is expected to double again this next year as American production, and Ukraine is launching its own and opening gunpowder factories. So there should be no more projectile hunger. However, it takes time. War eats up resources as quickly as it eats up people. Ukraine needs more of both, as well as improved training for the latter, and also, in too many cases, in leadership. But if Ukraine gets everything it needs between now and the next summer, a victory in 2025 is quite possible. But at least it can drag a little bit more. But 2026 can be exactly the year when we can break the initiative and win the war. Indeed, the basic assumption is that the Moscow will continue to lose its combat power at the current rate next year as well. Therefore, the expansion of cooperation between North Korea and Russia causes deep concern, as well as possibility of China transferring obsolete equipment through intermediaries. This has always been a risk when trying to imagine the world divided into autocratic and democratic blocs. In addition to the hypocrisy of the democratic side openly supporting numerous evil regimes, if China decides to increase its support for Moscow, the war in Ukraine could drag on for a very long time. So, hopefully, this will not happen, and Ukraine will finally take advantage of the front lines, but it will be impossible to do without strong Western support. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, please share with your friends.